Welcome to Homeward. I'm Jim Burns. The topic of sexuality is so often awkward and, well, yeah, confusing. Kids are receiving so many mixed messages, and too often, you know what one of those mixed messages are? From home? Simply silence. Well, interestingly enough, the culture isn't silent. And our guest today believes that kids are being sexually discipled by the world. I believe that too. No doubt it's time we rethink how we teach sex education to our kids. I'm one of those people who thinks we should have 100 1-minute conversations rather than just one 100-minute conversation, if you know what I mean. So honored today to have Dr. Juli Slattery with us. I'm actually really smiling because I think this is such a great conversation we're going to have. I look at Juli as no doubt one of the leading Christian thought leaders on the subject of sex and sexuality. She's a clinical psychologist. She's the author of some great books. She's a speaker, a recognized expert in the areas of biblical truth and sexuality. She's been married since 1994. She has 3 sons, and I have the deepest respect for her. And today we're talking about rethinking sexuality. And that's the name of her book. And I love the subtitle, God's Design and Why It Matters. All the information on this book, as well as her ministry and all the things that she is about, is on our podcast notes. And by the way, this is the 3rd in our series on sexual integrity, and I really think we've saved the best to last. Juli, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for the invitation, Jim. What an honor to be with you, and thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, well, it's great to be with you. And honestly, it's so good. So you have 3 sons, and we were talking about this right before the podcast. So you get introduced as an expert on sex. And, I'm guessing your 3 sons, when they were younger, even especially more, just kind of rolled their eyes. How did they react to that, having mom who talks on this subject?
Yeah, well, I started the ministry Authentic Intimacy, where this became my full-time ministry when they were in the tween and teen years. So that was painful for them, especially if they'd have like their friends' parents come up and say something or their
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
But now they're at the place where they'll actually be like, "Mom, we're proud of you. We understand why you do what you do." But yeah, it's not always been easy for
No,
them.
that's funny. I have 3 girls, and I remember one time taking my middle daughter, uh, to something I was speaking on to kids on sex, and she was
Mm,
like s she just I watched her just slink. She didn't know what I was
yeah.
talking about. That was a mistake, and she just kept slinking. She was coming to go to to hear the message partly, but to eat Mexican food afterwards, which is her favorite meal.
Yeah,
She was like, "Dad, I can't believe that you talk like that to kids," and, blah, blah, blah.
I
But anyway,
know. Yeah.
sex, as we talk about it, I mean, oh my gosh, it's such a beautiful thing, and it's a wonderful creation by God, and yet Christians sometimes get a really bad rap because, uh, well, we present the topic, and we haven't always done a good job of this. I mean, you say this in your book. I mean, we need to kind of rethink how we do this. Francis Schaeffer once said, and he was talking about the gospel, but he said, for every generation, we must rethink how we communicate the gospel to make it relevant. We don't change the gospel, he said, but we change the way we communicate it to this generation. I'm kind of thinking that's exactly what you're doing as we talk about rethinking sexuality.
Yeah. I think it's rethinking our entire approach,
Mhm.
Jim. We have kind of adopted a heritage of the concept that Christians don't talk openly about sexuality. They're kind of squeamish about it. And so people think, well, then God must not talk about it much either.
Yeah,
And so we live in a culture today where this is not only the issue of the day, but it also impacts the gospel.
sure.
So when I talk to pastors or apologists, they'll say, you can't talk about God anymore without the first questions being around sexuality. The first objections of how could a loving God say that sex is not okay between 2 men, or
Right.
that sex is supposed to be in marriage. And so this is not just a side discipleship issue anymore. It is actually part of the message of God's creation and how we think differently than the culture
Yeah,
thinks.
and we can't present it anymore mean-spirited. You don't. And we really can't because, again, it's so key and critical, and I was just reading a book on deconstruction of kids who are leaving the faith and then even young adults who are. And, one of the main reasons had nothing to do with Jesus. It had to do with sexuality.
Right.
So
Yeah.
so I appreciate you bringing that up. Interesting enough, you made an incredible comment in your book. You said, "Our silence on sex reinforces the belief that sexuality is dirty and ungodly." I want you to
Mhm.
unpack that for a moment.
Yeah. I think when you, for decades, go to church And anytime a sexual topic comes up, everybody gets awkward, or all of a sudden it becomes very high level instead of addressing the real question you might have about, I can't stop looking at pornography, or is masturbation wrong?
Mm,
Or my husband and I have all kinds of conflict around sex. When you bring those topics up, if you dare to, and the room gets weird and silent, then you immediately feel a sense of shame, not even just for having that question, but for bringing it out in the open.
yeah.
And if that's been your learned experience, which for most people in faith families, that has been their experience of sexuality, then the whole topic now is shrouded with a sense of we don't talk about that, and that just makes the shame pervasive, and feel like you're the only. I must be the only one who's asking this question. I
Right.
must be the only one with this struggle,
Right.
and so that just is shame upon
Yeah,
shame.
and when we think everybody else maybe has it together when they don't, so we
Right.
it's better to have an open conversation, a dialogue. You can have a God-honoring conversation about sexuality. He's the creator. He's the master designer, and yet you're right, we do get so awkward. I have an experience where I speak a lot to parents on teaching, sexual integrity, and even have a book now that's just come out on to kids on a student's guide to sexual integrity. And what's interesting is I'll say to parents, how many of you received good, positive, healthy sex education when you were growing up? I can be in a room of 400 and four people raise their hand. I mean, I've had it as
Mhm.
much. We were talking about wind shape before. I was at a conference, a marriage conference, and I asked how many, and one person raised their hand at that. That place. It's a wonderful conference center. One person said that they'd received good, healthy sex and sexuality. So guess what we talked about when we talked on marriage about intimacy? These people were still struggling to even have conversations with their spouse about it. What you're saying is no, open up the dialogue, bring it up. We shouldn't be, we shouldn't, we have to unshame the conversation.
Yeah, I think it was Howard Hendricks who said we should not be ashamed to talk about what God was not ashamed to create.
Ooh, love that.
And when we read the scripture, Old Testament and New Testament, God certainly isn't shy, and not just talking about the beauty of sexuality and our bodies and erotic love, but also the intricacies of the many ways it can go wrong, from incest to pornography
Yeah,
to rape,
right.
to prostitution. Like, we see all of that in the
Yeah,
scriptures.
yeah,
And we see many of our heroes of the faith and fathers of the faith struggling with these
sure,
things.
sure.
People often ask, like, when did we stop talking about this? I know even if you look at some ancient Jewish traditions and Catholic traditions, they've done a much better job
Yeah.
historically of tackling sexuality than I think Protestants
Well,
have in general.
no,
But
I think you're right.
this silence is not biblical,
No,
and I think we need to be reminded of that.
it's not good. If a pope in the past wrote a book on a theology of your body and sexuality,
Hmm.
well, we need to be doing that too. You're our popette for for this, and I appreciate it so much. Um, you put two words together that I have never heard in the same sentence, and I just got to say, you use a phrase "sexual discipleship." And
Hmm.
I love it, but there's a negative side to it and a positive side to it. The negative side, which you have said, is that, the world is sexually discipling our children and us, you know?
Hmm.
But there's also a positive side, and I want you to speak to both sides.
Yeah, when I say that term, most people are like, "What in the world do you mean by that?"
Yeah,
And they get sort of, I think, creeped out by it. But we're very comfortable with the term sex education.
right.
Um, so education is, I'm going to sit somebody down, I'm going to take them through a course of study. They have to learn this information. Discipleship is the lifelong pursuit of how we live, how we think, how we respond to situations. Education is what to think about sex. Discipleship is how to think about sex.
Yeah.
And so, at its best in the past, I think churches and Christian families have done some education,
Mhm.
but the culture disciples, and discipleship will always win against
Yeah.
education.
That's a great comment, and I think sometimes what in the field that I work in family ministry, we talk about parents being the primary disciplers of their kids, and that's foreign, and it's kinda coming around. It's better now, we're seeing that in churches, but we also have to be the disciplers of our kids when it comes to sex and sexuality, and I don't know that anybody feels totally equipped on this thing. And again, part of it was because it was awkward for them or they didn't hear it from their parents, so they didn't have role
Yeah.
models. What do you suggest to the parent who says, "You know what? Wow. listening to this conversation with Julie, I need to be more engaged with my own kids. I need to move from, doing sex education, maybe they're not, to
Mhm.
really discipling them. What do you suggest would be the healthy ways to do that?
Yeah, well, first of all, discipleship is the overflow of your own life.
Yeah.
You can't pass on what you don't
Love it.
possess.
Yeah.
And so, for the vast majority of Christian parents, they've never been discipled in their
Right.
sexuality.
Right.
They're struggling with their own questions, their own shame, their own brokenness. So, I really feel like a lot of us,
Yeah.
the first thing we need to do is do a deep dive into what we missed growing up,
Yeah.
which is not just what, again, does the Bible say you should do with your sexuality, but why does it matter to God?
Yeah.
Why is sex so shame filled? Why is it so intricate to who we are? And so a lot of our ministry is actually sexually discipling the parents
Yeah.
so that now it can come
Right.
as an overflow of what
Yeah.
God is doing in their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just, you think about it as an ongoing process of shepherding.
Yeah.
And so, in the youngest ages, it's giving your kids building blocks
Yeah.
so that they can
Sure.
understand the difference between the worldview that God created
Yeah.
and is revealing through his creation versus what the culture says is
Right.
we evolved and we
Yeah.
create our own purpose for everything.
Right.
Building blocks like sometimes we need to say no to what feels good,
Mhm.
and then we start even just with language at young ages and talking about our anatomy and the goodness of how God created us and the beauty of marriage, teaching and discipling and things like good pictures, bad pictures, and good touch, bad touch, and boundaries and modesty and all those things are building blocks that kids need to have, say before the ages of 10 or 11,
Yeah.
and then you can start getting into more of what we would traditionally call sex education, where we're teaching the purpose of sexuality and how to steward. But Jim, I think another very important paradigm shift for parents is you and I grew up with a mentality that sex was a pass fail test
Mhm.
for both the
Mm.
kid and the parent.
Yeah.
Like, can we get our kids to the marriage altar as
Right.
virgins?
Right.
And it was like either you're a virgin or you're not. We can't think about sexual integrity that way. Perhaps we never should have. We have to think about it in terms of the integration of the gospel.
Mm.
And the reality is that most kids in this generation are going to get mixed up in things like pornography, sexting, questions about gender identity or sexual orientation. They're going to be confused by these things. And so, discipleship is how do parents and other church leaders and mentors join them on that journey and bring the message of the gospel into those questions and even into the times where they fail. And that's a very different paradigm than I think most of us grew up thinking about related to our
I
sexuality.
appreciate you talking about the pass fail because I think that was ingrained into what we call the purity culture, the negative side of the purity culture. I mean, I love the word purity. It doesn't fit now because so many people had bad experiences with it. But what I hear you saying is, even with what you're saying even a little while ago, you build a foundation with your kids. God made your body. God made boys.
Hmm.
God made girls. Sometimes they never hear that, right?
Hmm.
And that's the foundation, and then that foundation gives you the ability to have the conversations that you were then talking about, gender identity, various things in the culture and whatnot, but do it from a different uh, a framework. It's interesting you talked about this because I think so often we don't mix spirituality and sexuality. And I literally just have a book out for kids, and I never thought I would write another. I wrote a lot of book for kids because I used to be a youth speaker, but I never thought I would do it. And this one's called a Student's Guide to Sexual Integrity, and I said it's the most spiritual book I've ever done. But when they say spiritual, they think it's going to be negative or God preaching, God's going to get you, and I don't think that's it. God is the master designer, so we need to let kids know that, he is the master designer and it's
Yeah.
his idea, but his even some of the things don't have fornication, sexual immorality, things like that. He's doing that to guard us and to help us. That's talking about guarding our hearts. So I really appreciate you saying that. Um, talking about that, you used another phrase where you said holy sexuality. When you said that, do you think when people hear that, they think of that as negative or positive?
I think most people are really confused when they hear those 2 words
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
They don't even know, like, where do I even start to
Right.
understand that?
Right.
Because you mentioned, the spirituality of our sexuality. In my experience of now 12 years full-time talking to Christians about sex,
Yeah.
what I've found is that most of us separate God and sex into different categories of life.
Yeah.
That
Right.
there's this natural sense of I worship God with this part of my being, but the sexual part, like I have no idea how to pray about that part of my life,
Right.
that God cares about that part of my life. All I know is that He doesn't want me to behave in certain ways.
Yeah.
And so we have such a limited understanding of the fullness and wholeness of what God created sexuality to be,
Yeah.
that I think most Christians think the best I can do in terms of holiness and sexuality is to avoid sin,
Yeah.
not to walk in the fullness
So
of God's creation,
right.
whether you're single or married.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of confusion around what does that even look like besides just avoiding sin?
That is the message we need to hear. And I appreciate you saying it so much. And by the way, everybody, authentic intimacy, and we've got all the information on how to get there on your show notes. You can just also Google it. But that, we all need to be mentored. We all need some discipleship. And, sometimes most good discipleship is person to person, but it can also be with reading and resources. And if you go to Authentic Intimacy, I was just there on the website. Julie's done an incredible job with that. So, get over there. Hey, look, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I'm going to kind of ask Julie a multi-level, a layered conversation. Her husband had dad nuggets with her kids, and I want to know what how he did dad nuggets with the boys. So we'll talk about that when we come back. Again, Dr. Juli Slattery is with us today. We're talking about rethinking sexuality as part of our 3-part series. Research says that the more positive, value-centered sex education kids receive from home, and I think I'm going to change the word education to discipleship, the less promiscuous, and interesting enough, the less confused they'll be. And that's research. By the way, that's secular research, okay? So we need to hear that and know that. Yet most parents didn't receive it from their home, so they're not passing it on to their kids. So the book Rethinking Sexuality is a great start. I literally have just read this book, and all the information, like I said, is in our show notes. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Don't go away.
I'm Erin Mashaw, and I want to invite you into an honest conversation about one of life's most awkward yet important topics, sex.
Conversations about sex can bring up all kinds of weird emotions, not the least of which is awkward. But that's not a reason to avoid the topic altogether.
So, if everybody's doing it, then what's the big deal?
Where do you go with your questions? There are lots of voices telling you who you are, how to dress, what to think, how to feel. So how do we know what to listen to? Who can we trust to guide us?
When we treat others with radical respect, we honor God, we make our lives and relationships better, and we reflect God's love to the world all around us.
Now, I know you might be thinking, what? I don't need guardrails. I have good intentions, but what if intention isn't enough?
And as you think about the path from where you are now to where you want to be, who are the friends that can help you get there?
You'll hear personal stories, helpful advice, and truth from the Bible about how to make wise choices when it comes to love, sex, and dating.
Imagine being able to look back on this stage of your life without regrets about the way you handled relationships. You're not going to get there by accident. You're going to have to decide in advance what guardrails to put in place to get to where you want to be.
Join us for a student's guide to sexual integrity.
Welcome back. I'm Jim Burns. Great conversation today with Dr. Juli Slattery today on rethinking sexuality. You told a fun story about your husband having dad nuggets, and when the guys are teenagers, they're probably rolling their eyes a little bit on dad nuggets, and they weren't all on sex and sexuality. But talk about those nuggets, because I said at the beginning of this podcast, I would rather, talking about sexuality, I'd rather have 1-minute conversations than hundreds of them than 100-minute conversation. Talk about those dad nuggets with how he got away with it.
Well, yeah, I think the kids did roll their eyes a few times. My husband is definitely a talker, like a verbal processor. So he would sit one of the boys down for kind of one of his dad chats, and he'd always say, "This is a nugget for you." And what he was saying from the heart of a dad is, this something I've learned over time that I
Yeah.
want to pass on to you.
Right.
And it's fun now that the boys are in their 20s to see them kind of refer back to those central nuggets that dad taught them.
Yeah.
And they're like, man, like we're doing those things that you taught us. So it was just sort of like a fun little
Yeah.
terminology that would describe kind of the wisdom that my husband wanted to
Well,
pass on to his three
what
sons.
I loved is that your husband would kind of pull him in and they'd have this conversation. And I had conversations with our girls, Kathy and I, we thought we actually did pretty good with sex education, even comparatively. I mean, we didn't think we did perfect. And not too long ago, my oldest daughter, Christy, said, "Oh, Dad thought he did a great job, but he could speak to thousands of kids about sex and sexuality. He'd get to us, he'd stutter, his bald head would sweat, his ears would
Yeah.
turn red." And I kind of thought about it. She goes, "It was so awkward. Dad was so awkward." And I thought, wait, I thought I was giving perfect nuggets, but I was going, ba, 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 ba.
You know, it's interesting, Jim. I would rather talk to 1,000 strangers than
Sure,
my own
sure,
kids.
sure.
And it's much more nerve-wracking
Yeah,
to look your own children in the eyes and to say very honest things and address hard
right,
issues. So,
right.
I have a lot of compassion and empathy for parents. This
Right.
is not easy. It
No,
doesn't matter. You
no.
can write books on it, and it's still a
Sure.
difficult
No,
conversation with your own children.
yeah, I mean, you're so right. I mean, you mentioned things that are very much involved that you're very much involved in, some of the tougher subjects. And with couples, I'll have a couple come to me, and we do a lot of marriage things here at Homeward, and they'll say, "I can talk to my wife about anything, but I can't talk to her about sex." Um,
Mhm.
or a woman say, "I've never had a conversation about sex and sexuality with my husband." You must hear those all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
So and they're even being intimate, but they're not willing to talk about it. So, they're that emotional involvement that oftentimes precedes good physical intimacy doesn't take place because we're not
No.
willing to.
Yeah, one of the things that I'll tell couples is there's a difference between being sexually active and sexually intimate. And you can't be sexually intimate without learning to talk, not just about
Right.
the basics of what you want or our bodies, but what is the meaning of
Yeah.
sex to
No,
you?
so good.
And how do you feel when you initiate and I say no?
Yeah.
What is talk about sexual shame and how you grew up
Yeah.
and how different situations have impacted you over the years.
Absolutely.
And most couples have no tools to even start having those kinds of conversations that forge true intimacy.
Right. Right. So true. What do you say to the person who's like, "Hey, I have just become a believer. I've been listening to Julie and I've been listening to Jim, and as they talk, I want to do something like this, but I have all kinds of sexual baggage, or I have some
Mhm.
real hurts I haven't even dealt with. But I do
Yeah.
want to talk to my kids, but I'm afraid on one level I won't do a good job, and number two, what if they ask me about me because I haven't really, told them everything." What do you say to that? You get that question, I'm sure, all the time. I get it all the time. What do
Yeah.
you say to that
Yeah.
person?
Well, I would say first of all, do your own work.
Mhm.
And it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect before you talk to your kids about sex, but at least be on the road to addressing these kinds of
Yeah.
issues,
Yeah.
so that you're not speaking from a place where you feel like, oh, I'm just sort of faking the right words, but in my heart of hearts, I have my own shame. But then also, and I know Jim, your ministry and research would be consistent with this. Teenagers in particular have the most respect for parents when they're real and vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when they see that you're not perfect, you're not
Right.
trying to be perfect,
Mhm.
but you're authentic. And so, I think there's definitely a place when age appropriate ways to let your kids know that I haven't always done this well. And actually, even as a 45-year-old dad, I'm dealing with some of the consequences of some of the decisions I made 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And when you get older, I'm happy to share some of that with you.
Yeah. No, I really
So
appreciate that. Yeah.
it's modeling that vulnerability. It's modeling that we're always still growing. That
Right.
God is a gracious God, but it's not particularly with a younger teenager giving them something to carry that they're not emotionally ready to
Right, right,
hold in
right.
terms of
Yeah,
details.
you're handing them if you give them too much detail too young, you're handing them a burden. But if you
Yes.
say, "You know what? I didn't always do it right. I have a passion for this, and because I didn't always do it right, my passion is to have conversation with you. And when you're older, we can talk." But
Hmm.
that's the part of being authentic. You're so right. Today's young people, teens, but also this next generation. And I say this to pastors all the time. They want authenticity. The Bible
Yeah.
says the man or woman of integrity walks securely. And I actually think of integrity doesn't mean perfect. It means being authentic in many ways, along with other things. But when you are authentic with your kids, then that brings security to them.
Mhm.
And we sometimes, get way too holier than thou, if you would. In one of your chapters, and this might have been one of my favorite chapters, it's called The Promise, where you say that Jesus came to redeem broken sexuality. And in many ways, by me reading that I literally read the chapter yesterday, but I sense that you think most people have a broken sexuality, and Jesus came to redeem that. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah. I actually believe that all people have a broken
What I
sexuality.
it's
Yeah.
funny is I read that, but I didn't wanna say it in case I missed it. But yeah, you're right. So
No,
talk about that. Yeah.
I wouldn't have told you that 15 years ago before I started this ministry.
Interesting.
Like, I was sort of the poster child for the Christian family, like growing up,
Yeah.
purity culture, all of it. And, I've learned that we have a very simplistic definition of wholeness, which means we have a simplistic definition of brokenness.
Yeah.
But when we understand more fully what God designed sex to be, we start to realize how short we fall of that. So every single person has had shame attached at some level with their sexuality. Every single person has, in word or deed or thought, objectified other people. Many of us have been sinned against, and some level, all of us are impacted by a pornographic culture, even if we don't look at porn.
Yeah.
And so we all have these lies and wounds around our sexuality that we don't know what to do with. And so we also live in a church culture where, again, there's really not a lot of direction on, well, then what's true, and how do we seek redemption, and how do we seek wholeness? And so we kind of stay stuck. And we don't realize that, no, like, God's redemption of our life is meant to involve every
Mm.
single aspect of who we are, including our sexuality.
Wow. That's just great news. I mentioned this to you before the podcast started, but I was having this conversation with one of our mutual friends, and she says Julie Slattery communicates about sexuality so clearly with love, grace, and truth, and she's willing to take on all the subjects. Now I'm thinking about the parents. So they hear you talk and they go, "Oh gosh, I want to be like, I want to be like her. I want to be able to talk like that." Well, like you say, you do this. This is authentic intimacy. This is your calling.
Hmm.
They want to have those kind of conversations with their kids. Their spouse doesn't even want to jump into it at all to talk with their kids about it. So it's super difficult for them. How do they learn to do what you're doing effectively within their own family? I'm not talking about speaking and writing and, being a
Hmm.
thought leader. I'm talking about in their family. How do they move from we've not had these conversations to beginning to tiptoe? I mean, there's going to be people who are going to go, you know what, tonight I need to sit down my 16-year-old and have this conversation. And I would say to them, please don't do that right now. They're going to say, well, what do you want to know, mom? What do you want to know? Right. But how do you develop this for the parent, not for people who are doing this for a living, but for the parent who's like, I just want to, and I don't even know how to start.
Yeah, I think we start everything in the Christian life by inviting God into it and praying. And God cares about this. So,
Right.
Lord, give me wisdom, give me the
Yeah.
words. And then I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, you know what, I haven't done a good job at this. I don't My parents didn't really talk to me about sex, but I even heard something today that just really, I'm sorry.
No
You'll
problem. Keep the
you'll get
dog
them.
going. This is a podcast.
Yeah.
We're good.
Yeah. But I think it's okay just to say, hey, like, I heard something today that really struck me. And I start to realize, like, we need to have more conversations about sexuality.
Yeah.
And I'm learning what it is to honor God with this area of my life. And I want to do a better job at being a safe place for you to talk.
Hmm. So good.
So, and then I would use resources. So, when we were raising our kids, when they were in those teen years, let me first tell you, my kids will never read my books or listen to my podcasts. They're like, that's just awkward, mom. And I get it,
Yeah.
but I will use other resources.
Sure.
So, I encourage them to read Sean McDowell's book, Chasing Love.
Love it.
We love the ministry Access,
Yeah.
where they have these really engaging videos and parent teen conversation guides. So we use things like that to kind of
Yeah.
set the parameters of the conversation to take some of the pressure off of the parent doing all the teaching.
Yeah.
And I think the other piece of it is recognizing that you have to walk before you run. And it's okay to stumble in these conversations.
Sure.
Give yourself lots of grace.
Mhm.
I was just talking to a parent yesterday, and I said, we are all kind of pioneers in this area
Mm.
because we can't ask our grandparents how they handled the gender identity question.
Right.
We can't ask them how they monitored smartphones. Like, this is all brand new.
So good.
And so every single parent is trying to figure out something that they've not had modeled for them. And it's so quickly evolving that we need to rely on the body of Christ as we learn together. We need to give each other lots of grace for figuring things out and sometimes making mistakes and learning along the way. God is with us. He gives us grace. He gives us wisdom. But don't be afraid of failing. Just step into it. And as much as you might fumble around and say the wrong thing, like, just keep the conversation going.
I actually want to take that part of our conversation and send it out to the world because that is so important and so good. We don't have to do it perfect. And we do have resources today. When your grandparents, they didn't have resources. Your parents didn't have many resources. But the truth is today we do have good resources. And I thank you so much for being here. One of the great resources, of course, is Authentic Intimacy and Juli Slattery. So it's so great to have you on our podcast today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for
Yeah.
giving me the opportunity to share.
Boy.
It was a joy.
Boy, time went by. Hey, don't forget to go to our show notes and you can get all things about Authentic Intimacy and her resources. Our job at Homeward is to provide world-class experts to you on subjects to help you build strong marriages and today confident parents. And you're never going to be confident, by the way, when it comes to talking to your kids about sex and sexuality. Just get over that one right there. But the truth is that when kids do get your authentic conversations, even if you're feeling like you're fumbling, that's going to help them like crazy. And it really does make a difference. Go back to the last two podcasts. If you haven't listened to them, they were great. And that'll help you kind of put this together. Like I said, we saved the best for last. And you can always go to homeward.com. We have great resources also on sex and sexuality for kids from 3 to 5, 6 to 9, teens, and then for you as well. So, don't hesitate to go there. And thanks for listening today on one of the major podcast platforms, as well as if you're watching it on the Homeward YouTube channel. An honor to have Juli with us today. Thanks for listening.